be a nice start to the illustration of, just to give you a little overview of what I want to talk about this evening. First of all, Newlands House Gallery have done an amazing job of showcasing Eve's work, all its glory and the stories on the panels. It really kind of captures what Eve's work was about and what Eve was about. So what I'd like to do is to kind of add to that kind of some personal stories, my memories of Eve, how she was an inspiration to me, some of the stories behind the photos. Some of them are on these panels, but I'd like to add in some other stories. But I guess the theme that I'd like to talk about is her approach to photography, her approach to life. And a story that I remember from a young age, so when I was about 5 years old, Eve invited me to, she was working on the film set of the film The Misfits. She did also do that over there, but she was working on The White Knights with Isabella Rossellini and Mikhail Baryshnikov. And I think I must have been about 7 years old, and Eve invited me to join the film set, and it was being filmed in Elstree Studios. And I obviously was very young, so I didn't know kind of fully what was going on, but just remember this huge excitement of being on a film set, and one of the camera crew kind of showed me what was going on, how he would set up the shots, and he even made got a plastic cup and cut the bottom out of it so I could set my own shots up. So he allowed me to kind of like take part in it, and I was thrilled. I just thought it was so exciting. And then at lunchtime, we had lunch with the crew, with the cast, and Mikhail Baryshnikov was there, Isabella Rossellini was there, and I think, obviously, being young, I didn't fully understand kind of what was going on, but I got the impression that these were important people, these were celebrities, and I remember kind of feeling a sense of kind of anticipation of kind of being daunted to be in the presence of these kind of celebrities. And but I remember very quickly being put at ease, and just the kind of warmth and the kind of welcome that I received, and soon kind of felt that it was, these were celebrities, but they were just ordinary people. There was a kind of I didn't need to kind of put them on a pedestal. And many years later, so when I moved to London, I was about 12 years old, and I would often go out to Eve's apartment. So Eve lived in central London, so she moved there in about 1960. And on the weekend, I'd go around to her apartment, and we'd either go out to a film or a play, and then we'd come back and sit around a table and talk for hours. But I remember on a few occasions we'd go out to see a performance, and people would come up to her after, and they'd recognise her. I remember once went to see a performance at Sadler's Wells, and someone came up to her and they recognised her, and they were kind of starstruck, and they were like, "Oh my God, it's Eve Arnold!" And I remember thinking like, "Oh wow, that's my grandmother," and they treated her like a celebrity, and it kind of really dawned on me that, and this is interesting because it's relevant to Eve's work. Because whether she was photographing celebrities, whether she was photographing the royal family or a working class family, it was the humanity of her work that would shine through. And I think that was a real lesson that I learned from her, was how she would treat everybody the same. And her work kind of tells this story about our shared humanity. But it also was something that I learned from seeing her interacting with people, that it's very easy to kind of put celebrities on a pedestal and think that they are somehow superhuman beings that us mere mortals can't ever live up to. And yet seeing Eve, one of the themes I want to talk about in this talk is actually the ways that she achieved her success, because some of the stories just seem impossible. How could she achieve the results that she did? And yet there were several traits that she deliberately nurtured throughout her life that were very much part of her success. And seeing that firsthand, kind of working with her and actually becoming friends with her, and she was a very close friend and a mentor to me, actually, someone I looked up to. But so I want to talk throughout this talk, as well as talking about the stories behind the images, I also want to talk about some of the traits that she deliberately cultivated throughout her career that actually were a big part of her success. So that's just that's a photograph of Mikhail Baryshnikov on the set of White Nights. It's an amazing film. I only just saw it about 10 years ago, the full film, but it's an amazing film. And he actually plays very similar to real life. He was actually escaped from communist Russia and defected as a Russian dancer. And he actually plays that character in the film. And he actually became quite close friends with Mikhail Baryshnikov. He lost his mother at a young age, and he kind of adopted Eve as a adopted mother. So the first trait that Eve had, but also cultivated, was curiosity. And she said, for example, if she ever stopped being curious, she wouldn't be able to do what she did. And I think you can see that throughout her work. There's this insatiable curiosity. She described herself as a news addict. She would be constantly scouring the newspapers, looking for the stories behind the stories. So she was never satisfied with just, okay, what's the surface level? What's the story that's being presented to be by the newspapers? It was this insatiable curiosity. She wanted to know what was going on behind the headlines. What was the person like behind the public facade? And I think that really shows itself when you look at a lot of the photographs. We're in the room, obviously, of Marilyn Monroe, and Eve had a very unique relationship. I'll go on later to talk about Eve's relationship with Marilyn Monroe. But I think it was that ability to form friendships because she genuinely was curious about people. She wanted to know what made them tick. She was curious about the world around us. And this quote, I think, is actually on one of the walls here as well. So, I've been poor and I wanted to document poverty. I had lost a child and I was obsessed with birth. I was interested in politics and I wanted to know how it affects our lives. I'm a woman and I wanted to know about women. And that's actually where the title of this show is taken from, To Know About Women. Because it was her experience of life that led her to want to discover, what does it mean to be a woman? What is the world around us? What is the political landscape around us? She was born one of 10 children in 1912 to Russian Jewish immigrants who escaped the pogroms in Russia. Her parents were from Ukraine, and she had quite a unique perspective on the world because of that. And her father was a rabbi, so they escaped to America in the early part of the 20th century. And he would say to Eve, in my lifetime, I've had to know great hardship and escape persecution. But imagine what you can do in your lifetime. If I can achieve this, if I can escape from certain death and make a life in America. And he was very much supportive of wanting her to dream and to dream big. And I think that was a big part of what actually led her to believe in herself, to led her to realize, what do I want to do? What can I do with my life? And think outside the box. And her and her father apparently would spend a lot of time thinking, what does she want to do? She thought about being a doctor. What does she want to do with her life? But interestingly, it wasn't actually until she was in her 40s that she discovered her career. And it's interesting, people in my work, so I'm an acupuncturist, so that's my day job, and I talk to young people who've come as patients, and they often say, I'm in my 30s, and I still haven't made it. I still haven't become successful. They see all these Instagram influencers, and they think, Justin Bieber, there's other people I don't even know about, but there's an idea that you should have made something huge in your life by the time you get to 20 or 30. And here was Eve just starting out her career in her 40s. And there's a quote that she said, I was planning on a long career. And she said, I knew that I had to have a strong constitution and good health because I wanted to have a long and fruitful career. And she was still working up into her 80s. So she went to Cuba when she was about 85 to go back to visit a woman that she'd met 40 years ago. And she did a follow-up on her story. But I want to come back first of all to the beginning of her career. So the Harlem fashion images. So you probably recognize this image. It's in the exhibition. That's a woman called Charlotte Stribling, aka Fabulous. And so Eve, before this, had worked at a photo finishing plant. So she had experience of photography. She would describe herself as an amateur photographer, but she'd also worked in a photo finishing plant. These were the early days of the first technology when you can send a film off and get the photograph developed and sent back to you. And they had factories where the development process would happen. And it was during the war, and she quickly became the manager of a photo finishing plant in New Jersey. And towards the end, she was actually managing two separate plants. And there was an opportunity because during the war, all the men had gone off to fight, and as a woman, that kind of job probably wouldn't have been given to a woman at that time. But up to that point, she described kind of going to. She lived in New York City. She described going to the Bowery. Everyone knows that Bowery in New York, that used to be kind of Skid Row. Now it's like a very affluent area. But she kind of described she would take all the classic amateur shots of homeless people, bums on the Bowery, and kind of. It wasn't until the masterclass with Harper's Bazaar director Alexei Brodovich. And she discovered this masterclass, and a friend went along with her, and she tells the story of how the very first class, and this is a class where people like Irving Penn graduated from. So it was a kind of very formative time in the world of photography, and she brought her friend along, and Alexei Brodovich said, "Does anybody have any work that they'd like to show?" And he was kind of very, I definitely don't want to show my work. And her friend said, "Oh yes, Eve does." And so she brought her photographs up to the front, and Alexei Brodovich just tore them apart, just completely tore into it. And because they're very amateurish, and she said she felt completely humiliated. But she also at the same time learned the most valuable lessons of her photography education, because she didn't, she had this masterclass. That was the most part of her kind of formative education, and I think that's something she didn't talk about this at the time. But kind of looking back on it, I think the ability to take on feedback. So instead of kind of saying, "Oh, I'm ruined," this is dreadful, I'm being eviscerated and torn apart. She kind of managed to swallow her pride and say, "Okay, what can I learn from this experience?" Because Alexei Brodovich was an extremely talented teacher, and she said actually what she learned from that class was incredible, and it actually formed the basis of what she did following that. And it was this ability to actually kind of, take the gold from the seemingly embarrassing situation and say, what can I learn from this? So her very first assignment, her nanny at the time lived in Harlem, and she knew about these fashion shows that would take place in Harlem. And she was just curious. She thought, okay, well, I want to go and find out about what's going on in these fashion shows. So the nanny found someone who could introduce her to someone at the churches where the fashion shows took place. And she decided to do her first assignment, because the assignment that Alexei Brodovich gave was on fashion. And she decided she wanted to do something different. She wanted to photograph the fashion shows that took place in Harlem. And this was before the kind of civil rights movement in America. This was like 1950. So there was no problem. She didn't describe kind of having any kind of animosity or any problem for her to go up to Harlem. But it was also very groundbreaking, because at the time fashion photography was very much studio lit, glamorized, and it was very, very early days of photojournalism. And but again, Eve was led by her sense of curiosity. She wanted to kind of find out what was happening in these fashion shows. And she would even just go backstage, and you see a lot of images. I'll show this one. And there's more on the walls of the models getting ready, putting their makeup on, getting dressed. And she didn't realize that that's kind of not what you're going to do. She just decided, right, I'm going to follow my instincts, follow my nose, and she got some amazing pictures of these models getting ready, kind of joking around. And she took them back to Alexei Brodovich, who was doing a masterclass, and he loved them. He actually, second time round, he actually said he held them up as an example to the class, having been torn apart the first time. He held them up as an example and said, look, this is what I want you guys to do. And he said, Eve, go back and make a full study of the Harlem Fashion Show. And that's what she did. And here she describes, in the book, in retrospect. So she said, for a year I haunted Harlem, spending practically every weekend in a bar, a church, hall or restaurant, where the black women came to show their handiwork. The clothing was either made by the models themselves or by local seamstresses. Partly as a protest against the white establishment 7th Avenue schmatter trade, it was one of the forerunners of the civil rights movement. So, and she learned some valuable lessons in doing this project. So she described that initially when she was starting to take photographs and she had a flash and she became very conspicuous. And the models would start to kind of pose and pout, and that was not what she wanted. She wanted a very unposed. She wanted to be in their natural state. And she said, lesson number 1, beware of the intrusion of the camera. And little did she know that that was actually the beginning of her kind of characteristic style, which was to be unimposing, to kind of impose as little as possible on the situation, so that she was actually documenting what was going on. And interestingly, she describes that one of the early photo sessions, she brought a flash along with her, but the bulb wouldn't go off. And she was devastated because she didn't know if there was enough ambient light. And she describes going back to the dark room and actually printing the photos and then crossing her fingers, hoping that these photos would come out. And luckily they did, and they looked wonderful. And she realized actually that there was a particular quality to the light when she used natural light rather than the flash. And she actually wanted that, and she realized that this was something fresh, and it was something natural that was actually going with what she was going for. That she wanted something natural. She didn't want the studio lit portraits that were very common at that time. So this is then moving on to the birth series. Actually, I'll go back and I'll tell the rest of the story about what actually happened. Some of you may know this, but I always find it amazing. So what happened after she completed this study in Harlem, she then, her husband at the time had a contact at Picture Post magazine in Europe, and sent the photos to Picture Post magazine. And they loved them, because they were completely different, they were completely fresh. And they published them. And Henri Cartier-Bresson, who had just founded Magnum Photos at the time, saw them in Picture Post magazine and invited Eve to come to the office in Paris that he just set up, and invited her to become an early member of Magnum Photos. And I think Eve was as amazed as, it's quite an incredible story. Just an incredible break to have this opportunity. And it opened up a lot of doors for her. It opened up possibilities to get into the world of reportage, of photojournalism. And she had various projects and curiosities and interests that she wanted to explore. And one of the first photo stories she did, because she suffered a miscarriage. And in a way, the photography was kind of therapy for her. So she actually used the exploration through photography to actually process what had happened to her. And that's how she came to go into a hospital and photograph this story, which is called The First 5 Minutes of a Baby's Life. And again, that's the most iconic image of it, but there's, I think it's the room downstairs on the left, where there's other images of this story. And she tells a very interesting story about this. She said she photographed the whole story in black and white, and at one point she decided she was going to photograph in colour. She bought a camera that had colour. This was the early days of colour. And as soon as she held the lens up to the scene, she fainted, because she visualized it in colour. Whereas when she was looking at it, imagining it was going to turn out black and white, she saw it in a very different way. But when she saw the blood in red, suddenly she fainted. Which is quite an amazing story to kind of, because she was already kind of visualizing what it was going to look like when she was taking the pictures. And this is another story. This is slightly later. So this is the start of the civil rights movement. And what was happening was that there were white-only establishments, white-only cafes, and there was a movement of non-violent protest where black people would go in and have what we call sit-ins. So they would sit in the white-only cafes as a protest for segregation. And what's happening here, it's a strange image, and it looks like he's somehow tormenting or harassing her. But what's happening in this image, it's a training to habituate the people to provocation. Because what would happen is they would have the peaceful protest, they would sit in, and then people would come up to them and spit at them and say all kinds of unspeakable things and blow smoke in their faces. And they had training deliberately, because they knew that was going to happen, they had training to just sit there and not rise to the provocation. So Eve would often say, when she ever had exhibitions actually, that the interesting relationship between the caption and the photograph. So she would say that what would happen is, when someone would look at the photograph, they would look at the photograph first, they would look at the caption, and hopefully if the caption was done well, it would give some information that would then allow the person to understand more about the photograph, and they would go back to the photograph to deepen their understanding of what was going on in the image. So the images kind of stand alone, but when you tell the stories behind it, it kind of adds an extra kind of depth to it. And the one thing that was amazing about Eve is she always had a different story for each occasion. So I would often go to she was more social than I was as a teenager. She would go to dinner parties. She would have social occasions like more times than I would. But she would often at like a dinner party, someone would say something, and she'd say, "Oh, there's an interesting story about that," and it would never be the same story. She would always have a different story for each occasion, which I just find mind blowing. She wasn't one of these people who reel out the same stories again and again. It was completely the opposite. And this is another example of Eve's curiosity. This is a really fascinating story. So, in the late 1960s, Eve went to Dubai, and she was invited to photograph the wedding of a princess. So she's a princess in Dubai. And while she was there, she became friends with this woman. And this is again a kind of theme running through Eve's life and her work. The kind of rapport and the curiosity and the compassion led her to form great relationships with people, because she was naturally curious. And what came out of that was that Eve was then invited back to go into a harem in Dubai to photograph veiled women. And this was something that had never happened. There had never been a camera crew that was allowed in from the West to photograph a harem. And Eve thought this was a wonderful opportunity. She was very excited about it. She went back to London. I think she was working for the Sunday Times magazine. So the story of the initial story came out in the Sunday Times magazine. And she then got a phone call from the BBC, who said, "We'd love to do this documentary about women in harems in Dubai." And she started to organise it. And then she realised that she was going to have an all-female crew to go inside the harems. And what happened next was fascinating, because it taught her about actually the state of play of women's rights in the UK at that time, in the West. Because it turned out that they couldn't find an all-female crew that the BBC could approve, because there weren't enough women that were actually approved by the association that they needed to be a member of. And Eve just thought this was crazy. So she actually had to say, "Look, I've got some women that I want to work with on this film. Can we just make sure that they're members of the association that they need to be?" And the BBC had to say, "Okay, well, we're going to have to, because otherwise the film's not going to go ahead." So the aim was to kind of shed light on veiled women in Dubai, and then shedding light on the state of women's equality in the UK. And this is a great image. I love this. This is not actually in the show. So this was in the 1970s, at the start of the AIDS pandemic, the AIDS crisis, when it first started. And Eve went to San Francisco to photograph the gay community in San Francisco. And this is one of a member of what they call themselves the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And again, I think this, a lot of Eve's work, there's, I'll go into this later, but Eve's work kind of falls into two broad categories. You could categorize it as celebrity and dispossessed people or kind of downtrodden people or people being marginalized by society. But again, there's always this theme of the humanity that kind of unites it. But I think because kind of having been marginalized, her parents had escaped from the pogroms in Russia, I think she knew something about marginalization and about oppression. And I think that's where naturally her curiosity to photograph people who had been oppressed or marginalized came from. She felt an affinity and she wanted to explore what it meant. And it's interesting that now that the themes that she photographed 60 years ago are still, in fact, they've been talked about more than ever. And the interesting thing was that when she was photographing, she was very careful to document it she didn't want to be political. She didn't want to kind of put her own views onto it. She wanted to just document what she saw in a journalistic way. And I think also at the time, the conversations that are happening now weren't so easy to have. But I think that the themes that she photographed are as relevant then, relevant now as they were then, if not more so. So I want to talk about the next theme, which is compassion. And he talks about it in this quote. He said, if a photographer cares about the people before the lens and is compassionate, much is given. It is the photographer, not the camera, that is the instrument. And I think this is a really interesting quote. And actually, she said it, but she also lived by it. And kind of seeing her, it wasn't just the people that she photographed. It was the people, it was her friends, it was the people around her. She treated everyone the same. She treated them with respect and with humility and with compassion. And those evenings that I would sit around the dining room table with her after a performance, she was an amazing listener. She wanted to hear about what was going on in my life. I could tell her what was going on, where I wanted to be when I grow up, any kind of challenges I had, family kind of challenges I was having. And she listened without judgment. That was something amazing. She never kind of put her oar in and said, "Oh yeah, I think you should do that." She asked questions. She was curious. She allowed me to explore what was right for me. And that's how she was with the people she worked with, the people she photographed too. She wanted to show something of who they were under the surface. So in the early 1950s, after she started working with Marilyn Monroe, she got the opportunity to photograph Marina Dietrich. And this was the first celebrity that she started to work with. And she was aware of her perception of Hollywood, and she talked to this quote, an interview where she talked about how women in Hollywood were always portrayed as glamorized, kind of retouched, like commodities in a way. And she wanted to do something different, as a woman, but also artistically. She felt it was time to actually show women working in a natural environment rather than a one-dimensional glamorized commodity that was kind of on screen. So when she photographed, this was a recording studio session where Marina Dietrich was recording songs that had made her famous during the Second World War. And Eve decided that she wanted the working woman. She wanted to see her in the studio at work. And apparently Marina Dietrich reported afterwards, she said, that Eve Arnold, she wouldn't leave me alone. She stayed, because it was an all-night recording session, she stayed until 6 in the morning. She wouldn't leave me alone. She was following me around everywhere. But again, I think that was Eve's kind of curiosity and desire to kind of really get to the person, but behind the kind of surface layer. And you can really see with these images that there's a very real and genuine side to Marina Dietrich that perhaps you wouldn't have seen in other photographs that she captures in these images. That's another kind of really iconic one of her, just kind of resting between takes. A bit like, you can't see it, but there's another one of Marilyn Monroe where she's resting between takes there. Let's see what the next thing is. But this was a theme that kind of reoccurred throughout her career. And in fact, Eve's first book was entitled The Unretouched Woman. And in it, she talked about, or she had photographs of celebrities, but also just women around the world, because she wanted to, again, show something real of real women's lives, whether they were Marina Dietrich, whether they were Marilyn Monroe, whether there were women in the harem in the UAE, whether there was a housewife in the UK. She wanted to show something of what it meant to be a woman, because again, it sounds kind of strange in these times, but a lot of the photographs that appeared in the magazines were very kind of unrealistic, kind of unattainable, and very very much retouched. So hence the title, The Unretouched Woman. It was very much glamorized and retouched. And she described even that it was almost like when a photographer took a picture of a woman for a glamour magazine, it was almost like they were lighting a packet of cigarettes. She described it that it was commodities. It was the hair, it was the face, it was the lips, it was the breast, it was the legs. And she wanted to kind of really do something very different and to actually show the depth of experience of what it meant to be a woman. So let's move on to Eve's relationship with Marilyn Monroe, because it was actually shortly after she started working with Marina Dietrich that she was introduced to Marilyn Monroe at a party in Hollywood. And she tells this amazing story about how Marilyn Monroe was quite early on in her career at that point, and so was Eve. And Marilyn Monroe came up to Eve, and the first thing she said to Eve was, "I saw the photographs in Esquire of Marina Dietrich. If you could do that with Marlene, imagine what you could do with me." and Eve just thought this, but there was this sense of, it wasn't bravado, but it was like confidence, and she knew what she wanted. She wanted to create this image of Marilyn, and Eve just found her enthusiasm just wonderful. And they did the first shoot that they did is actually on the back wall, you can see. And there's another image further on from that shoot. But there was a kind of playfulness in the way that they worked together. And they instantly kind of formed a connection. And Eve described how Eve was a neophyte photographer, and Marilyn Monroe was actually starting out relatively early on in her career. And they formed this bond over the fact that they were both relatively inexperienced. But because of that, they decided they could play and they could have fun, they could try things out. And Eve described in one of her books this kind of playfulness that over the years. So one thing that Eve would tell that story about how she kind of was a chance meeting with Marilyn Monroe. And it sounded like, isn't that incredible? Yes, there was an element of luck in it. But the thing is, if Eve hadn't formed that relationship with Marilyn Monroe, if she hadn't gained her trust, and if she hadn't had the curiosity and the compassion, they wouldn't have had this long working relationship. And they ended up working together for 10 years. Doing multiple photo sessions together. The longest one of them was 3 months when she photographed Marilyn Monroe on the set of The Misfits. But Eve describes this kind of playfulness that Marilyn allowed her, and she said, each time they worked together, and almost in each shot, from kind of moment to moment, she would be kind of, because she's an actress obviously, she would be acting out different aspects of who she was. She was able to explore and to enjoy that kind of playful relationship between the photographer and the subject. And but she was also aware of the images that she was creating. And Eve told this amazing story about she was in a taxi in New York City with Marilyn Monroe. And the taxi driver looked around and she said, "You know what, if you dolled yourself up, you'd look like Marilyn Monroe." And then Marilyn Monroe gets out of the taxi and puts on the Marilyn Monroe. She kind of stood up to her full height. And she said, Eve said she would do this thing where she would jut her chest out and kind of put on the Marilyn. And the taxi driver was like, "Oh my God, it is Marilyn Monroe," but he didn't realise. So there was this kind of, there's very kind of conscious that she wanted to create this kind of star. And this photograph is actually very interesting because when Eve arrived on the set of The Misfit, this was kind of towards the end of Marilyn's life. And I think this was taken in 1960, and I think she died in 61, 62. But when Eve arrived on the set of The Misfits, Marilyn Monroe was kind of very, she looked at Eve and she confided in her because she realised she could trust her. And she said, "Look, I'm struggling," because at that time her relationship with Arthur Miller her marriage was breaking down. She'd done several films in a row, she was kind of feeling burnt out. she'd reached, and the way you described it was that she realized that she'd reached this kind of pinnacle of success, where she was the most famous actress in the whole world, and she got there and she realized that it wasn't making her happy. And this image is actually, she's learning her lines on the set of The Misfits, and at that time she was struggling with depression, she wasn't sleeping, and also she was with her childhood hero, Clark Gable. And she described how when she was young she always had this dream, because she grew up in an orphanage, she was an orphan, and she had this dream that Clark Gable would come to the orphanage, and then she was playing alongside him in the film The Misfits. And she suddenly started to become very self-conscious and aware that here was her hero, who was this amazing actor, and she was kind of doubting herself. And I think this photograph, when you understand that, you can see that she's really kind of like doubting herself, and she's trying to go over her lines, because she kept forgetting the lines in the middle of the scene. So it's a kind of rare moment of vulnerability. And there's a few others like that one in the casino, where you can see that again that there's this kind of frailty and kind of fragility and vulnerability behind this image of the star. But because Eve was close to her and they formed a friendship, she was able to show something of what was going on for her at the time. So this is actually from the very first photo shoot they did together. This one, where is it? I think it's on this one or something. Maybe it's not. Anyway. But this is a wonderful one. I love this one. So what was happening? She dressed up in a leopard skin bathing suit, and she would come up with scenarios. So Eve would come up with scenarios, but she would also come up with scenarios too. And Eve described that she can't see it, but there's a whole lot of mud down here. So it looks like it's full rushes, but she had to get down on her hands and knees and kind of roll around in the mud. It was her idea. She was like playing being a tiger. She was getting her hands dirty. Literally, she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty to play and to kind of create these scenarios. So as Eve kind of described, that wouldn't be possible without that kind of close relationship. That they trusted each other. Eve trusted Marilyn to she knew what she was doing, and she would come up with these scenarios. And Marilyn trusted Eve that she was going to portray her in the way that she wanted to be portrayed. That's another fantastic one. So this is again on the set of The Misfits in the Nevada desert. So again, it's kind of slightly more posed, but you can still see there's a more playfulness about it. So I want to talk a little bit also about so Eve being a female photographer. So she said, I didn't want to be a woman photographer. That would limit me. I wanted to be a photographer who was a woman with all the world open to my camera. And I think she would certainly have been glad that she has been an inspiration to many female photographers. And but it's an interesting point, because she went on to say in the same quote, my male colleagues were not talked about in inverted commas. You wouldn't call Cartier-Bresson a male photographer. You wouldn't call Robert Capa a male photographer. And she makes a very good point. And while there is this, it's great that there is more of a movement these days for celebrating women photographers. But she always wanted to be known as a photographer rather than a female photographer. And people would say things like, how did it affect you? Did it limit you being a woman in a male-dominated world? And it was at a time when she started out in the 1950s where for a woman to travelling the world and being a photojournalist was not common at all. The typical 1950s was that women stayed at home and looked after the family. And she talked about this, and this is another kind of aspect of how she was great at turning disadvantages into advantages. And this is something that she cultivated again, like with the qualities of curiosity and compassion. that I think was a big contributing factor in her success, because it would have been very easy to say, oh yes, I'm at a disadvantage because I'm a woman. But actually she turned it around and said, okay, well, what advantages do I have? And she said, being a woman is just a marvellous plus in photographing. Men like to be photographed by women, it becomes flirtatious and fun, and women feel less as they're expected to be in a relationship. So she actually kind of turned it around, and she actually was able to be kind of flirtatious with the men that she photographed, and for the women that she photographed, it was less threatening. And also, I don't know, you probably don't know, but she was like 5 foot nothing. She was very tiny, very unassuming, and I think she also played that to her advantage. She was very good at kind of playing the role of the little unassuming woman. And she had most of her career she had grey hair, and but behind that she was extremely feisty. She was very determined. If she wanted something, she would find a way of getting it. But at the same time, she would also use it to her advantage. You know, people might underestimate her, and she would use that to her advantage. But also the way that she would go about getting what she wanted, it wasn't in a kind of aggressive way. It was to do with curiosity and compassion, and she would get to know people, and she would find out what they wanted and what motivated them, and find a way to help them to get what they wanted, at the same time getting what she wanted. So it's almost like the irresistible force, and you couldn't resist. When she wanted something, it wasn't that she pushed, it's just that there was nothing to resist. What was the other point I was going to make about that? Oh yes, and there's a great story. So she tells a story about, so when she was photographing Marilyn Monroe at a press conference with Laurence Olivier for the film The Princess and the Showgirl, there was a big crowd of reporters standing around to watch. They were up on the balcony, and they all ushered Eve through, and some of them knew her, but they thought, let the little woman come through, and she managed to get the best spot. She was right in the front and had the best spot to get the best pictures. So I think there was something about her spirit and her attitude. You know, she was always looking for opportunities. She didn't see obstacles; she saw opportunities. So coming back to kind of being a photographer, a female photographer, or being a woman who is a photographer, what she also learned was that your family is not always going to be supportive. This is Eve's mother, Bessie. I never met her. This is my dad, Frank. And Eve took this photograph of the two of them together. Bessie was an incredible cook, and taught Eve to cook as well, and Eve was an amazing cook. But throughout most of Eve's life, Bessie never really understood Eve's choice of career. She never really kind of gave a lot of praise. And Eve said, the best that she could muster was the kind of Jewish mother, meh. And I think towards the end of her career, when Eve started getting accolades and awards, I think she kind of gave kind of grudging praise. But she realised that from her mother, she was never going to get the adulation. And I think that's often the case for anyone who achieves any kind of success. It's kind of there may be awards, but there may be family who don't understand. So let's move on to the next thing. So the next topic I want to talk about was Eve's preparation was second to none. So she set herself up for success. There was elements, she recognised there was elements of luck in her success, but also she really researched her topic inside out before she even started on an assignment. And one example of that is when she photographed Malcolm X. So this was in 1961, and Malcolm X was part of the Nation of Islam. And she was fascinated by the movement. She was fascinated by the influence that Malcolm X was having on the whole of America at that time. And she wanted to meet him, and she wanted to photograph him. So there was a story that was for Life. I think it was Life magazine had assigned her to do this story, and she had to get someone as a fixer to introduce her to Malcolm X, because he was very wary of anybody coming to meet him, because his life was in danger. So he had to go via, Eve had to go via somebody who fixed the relationship so that he could meet her. And she met with this guy in Little Italy in New York City. And he waited and waited, and finally the guy arrived like 2 hours late. And when he arrived, he made lewd comments, and he started saying, "Oh, I know why you want to meet Malcolm X. You want to sleep with a black man, don't you?" And he was like, I'm getting up. And she literally got up to leave. And the guy said, no, come back, I'm testing you. And this was a test that Malcolm X had wanted to really test to see if anybody who wanted to meet him was actually committed to actually meeting him. And for this story, there's another fascinating story that for this story about Malcolm X, she actually went and met, so she obviously met with him, but she went and met with various people who had been influenced by the Nation of Islam, who were part of the Nation of Islam. And she tells this story of this one man who she met in a restaurant, and he was a busboy, so he was making very little wage. He was a busboy in a restaurant, and yet he was impeccably dressed. He had on a suit and a tie, and he had an air of self-respect about him. And she interviewed him and asked him, what influences Malcolm X had on her life. And he described this kind of feeling of being able to respect himself, because at that time, being a black person in America, it was not a good place to be, and it was very easy to not have any self-respect and to take all that hatred that was coming to them and turn it internally. And he said for the first time he was able to respect himself and to realise. And Eve kind of, from doing these interviews with people that were around, she met with Malcolm X, but interviewing people who were around him, she began to really understand the significance of what he was about, and the movement of black empowerment that he started. And at that time he was preaching separation, so he wanted the black and white community to be completely separated. Later he disavowed the Nation of Islam and embraced the non-violent approach that Martin Luther King was advocating. But his message of the black people have taken this situation for long enough. It's time to change. It started to resonate. But this whole assignment that Eve took on also required a lot of courage, because although when she met Malcolm X, he was very friendly. He kind of welcomed her in, and he would joke with her. And he met with her in a restaurant, and she ordered bean stew. And the stew arrived, and he said, "Enjoy the white bean stew." and he said white with a kind of, and he was like, wasn't sure I'd take it, and he looked at her and laughed, and he was making a joke. So they formed this great kind of relationship and bond, and they could play together. And he was very aware of the kind of image that he wanted to portray as well. And she described this photograph as well. It was a kind of collaboration between her and Malcolm X, that he wanted to he obviously got the Nation of Islam ring there. So make this work. And there's an element of kind of posing, but it's also about the relationship between Eve and Malcolm X, co-creating the image together.
It's a very strong image, isn't it?
Yes, and it's one of the perhaps the most iconic image of Malcolm X. I want to leave time for questions at the end. Let's see what time it is. So yeah, there will be time for questions at the end. So yeah, I chose this one because it's a great example of the men kind of, these are the men filing into the hall where Malcolm X was giving his speech, and you can see they're kind of dressed up to the nines as if they're going to a church service. And this kind of brings me on to another element of Eve's kind of what characterized her approach and her work. Because she had to have immense courage. I mean, so like I said, Malcolm X was very welcoming and friendly to her. But when she did this story, when she was working on the Malcolm X story, she was called up every morning at 7 a.m. and the man at the end of the phone would just say, "Get out while you can." Because for her to be photographing and documenting Malcolm X was a very dangerous situation. There was a lot of tension between the blacks and whites in America at that time. And she was putting herself in great danger. And there's another story. So this is the this on the surface it looks like a very strange image. Because you can see here George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the head of the American Nazi Party at the time, flanked by his deputies, at a meeting of the Nation of Islam. So it's a very evocative, very strange image. But what was happening was Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were, the thinking was that integration had no chance of working, and they decided to separate the segregationist movement, and they were meeting with the American Nazi Party with the aim of saying, look, you can have one side of America and we'll have the other side. Literally, they were going to divide America up. It's terrifying to think that. But Eve was photographing George Lincoln Rockwell, and he kind of hissed to her under his breath. He said, "I'll turn you into a bar of soap." And quick as a flash, she wasn't daunted by this, but I think she obviously later on she kind of, it was quite shocking. But she quick as a flash, she just hissed back to him, "Well, at least it's not a lampshade." So I can't just imagine the how much she must have been feeling at that moment. People asked her, were you terrified? And she said the whole time she was on assignment, she was so focused on the assignment, she kept her nerves at bay. But then as soon as the assignment finished, she developed a case of the shakes. So it must have affected her on a deep level, but she just didn't let it affect her. She just kept on going with the assignment. And there's a great quote by Elliot Erwitt, another magazine photographer, obviously. He said, "She's very well known for the famous people that she photographed, but I don't think that does her service, because that's easy stuff. She did the tough things." This is another great story relating to that same kind of courageous spirit that she had, that same kind of determination to get the story behind the images, or the images behind the story. So again, this takes a bit of explanation. It's hard to understand what's really going on in this image. So Eve was sent by the Sunday Times magazine to Russia at a time when Russia was not open to the West. It was very much during the Cold War. And she was accompanied by a KGB chaperone the whole time. And they would show her to various places and buildings and facilities in Russia. And this was in a psychiatric hospital. She was escorted around a psychiatric hospital, and they thought it was going to be good PR for isn't Russia amazing, and look what we're doing. The KGB chaperone had to be called off for something else, and she saw her opportunity, and she just dashed down the corridor, opened the door, and she was confronted with political prisoners. So these are actually, it's a psychiatric hospital, but they're doped up to the eyeballs, obviously on tranquilizers. And these are political dissidents who were being put in the psychiatric hospital to silence them. And then she raced back, she just took a snap, raced back, and her heart was pounding, she said, but the KGB chaperone never realized. So I next want to finish up by talking about how Eve was able to take the mundane and to show something of the specialness of it. She even said, so it's the hardest thing in the world to take the mundane and try to show how special it is. I've got some examples of those. So this is a story that she did in the Sunday Times magazine. So in 1960 she moved from America to the UK, and she got a job at the Sunday Times magazine. And this was a story about working women in the UK. So this is a woman who was sharing a bedsit in London. I think she was a secretary. She was living in Kensington at a time when, as a secretary, you could live in Kensington in 1960. But there's something kind of wonderful. It's mundane. It's ongoing about the everyday life. And yet there's a beauty to it. There's something kind of very poignant and beautiful about the image. And this is another one of my favourites. This is in the exhibition, and I think it's downstairs. No, it's along that way. It's along with the travel indeed. So Eve was sent to China again with the Sunday Times magazine, and later went back to create a whole book. And this is also an example of her tenacity and her kind of never giving up, because she was fascinated with China. So this is in Mongolia. For many years she was fascinated by China, and she read books and books of people talking about their travels in China, and she would wanted to go to China, but because of the Cultural Revolution she was never able to go. And she applied for a visa 15 years in a row. She just kept applying. And finally she met somebody who introduced her to someone at the embassy who was able to grant her a visa to go to China. This was 1979. And she went on 2 trips, and she went the maximum possible time was 3 months. So she went 2 trips of 3 months. And again, this is a great example of it looks like a very peaceful situation. There's the poignancy of a kind of seemingly very simple situation. What she's actually doing, she's training the horse to pretend to be dead for the local militia. But there's a kind of real sense of peace. It's the kind of juxtaposition of the peace, the peacefulness of the image, and then kind of realizing what she's doing and why she's lying there. This is a photograph of acupuncture and moxibustion. So when he was in China, she photographed people giving acupuncture and receiving acupuncture. And at the time, she developed a bad back from as she described it, schlepping cameras around the world. And she went to see an acupuncturist and gave her 1 session, and she was pain-free for about 2 or 3 years after that. And she was always amazed by that. And I don't know whether I subconsciously kind of remember that story. As I said, I'm an acupuncturist. I've been practicing acupuncture for about 20 years, and I set up an acupuncture school. But aside from that, I think what I learned from from Eve, from seeing Eve's example in my own life, is when I first started out, when I first realised I wanted to be an acupuncturist, it was from my own experience of having it. I had a very profound, transformative experience of having acupuncture. And people would say things, oh, does it even work? Is there evidence? And can you make a career out of that? You're going to have to be self-employed and build your own business. But I think, having seen Eve as an example of what she was able to do in her lifetime, I thought, well, why not, if I want to do it? And she would even say things like, she was like, Michael, whatever you want to do, if you have a passion for it, you can make it happen. It's not going to be easy. But I think having seen her as an example of what she was able to achieve in her life was a huge inspiration for me growing up, kind of seeing that she was flesh and blood. She was a mere mortal. She wasn't kind of someone who was kind of born with some kind of superhuman strength or superhuman gift. She kind of worked on it herself, and she worked on it. And she had an incredibly rich and varied and amazing life. I think this is another one. This is another one of my favourite images. This is another wonderful example of the seemingly ordinary, the mundane, but the beauty and the poignancy. So this is the caption of this is a bar girl in a brothel in Cuba, and she's quite likely a prostitute. But and it's interesting. I always used to think this said crisis. I think it's actually Christo. It's the name of the beer. But because the emotion of the image kind of draws you to this feeling of kind of like, what's going on in this woman's mind? There's a real kind of melancholy you can kind of see in her eyes, and yet there's a beauty to the image at the same time. And then this kind of leads me on to another one of Eve's great quotes that kind of relates to the compassion, which he said, if you are careful with people, they will offer you part of themselves. That is a big secret. And I just want to end on that image, because I think that's another beautiful example. This image is actually very interesting, the way it came about. This was an old lady in China And Eve, I think she was getting off a train at the time in China. She'd been travelling around China, and this woman suddenly appeared, and she was silhouetted in a doorway. And she just saw this woman, and she realised, oh my God, I need to photograph this woman. So, and I think it was only one or two. I think she only took one snap. She had time to take literally close the shutter once. And she describes what happened afterwards. So she went back to her assistant and said, "Could you find out about?" She couldn't speak Chinese, obviously, and this woman spoke no English. And she said, "I want to find out about this woman. What does she do? What's she like? Tell me about her." And she went back and talked to this lady, and then came back to Eve, and she said, "Oh, she's a retired lady." And that was it. And he was like, "That's it?" And she said, "Well, it wouldn't have been proper to ask more." I think she was very she was respectful of this elderly lady. She didn't want to pry. So this woman's always remained a kind of enigma, and in a way, there's something beautiful about that we don't know anything about her, and yet her face speaks 1,000 stories. Each kind of line of her face and the eyes, the kind of piercingness of her eyes, kind of tells 1,000 stories. And I'll finish with another interesting, funny story. So when I was growing up, when I was about 5 years old, we had a poster of this on our wall, and I used to think that was Eve. I used to think there was a self-portrait of Eve. I gradually kind of grew up and realised that it wasn't. But I think still when I look at it, and my stepmom, when she came to see the opening of the show, and she saw the print of it on the wall, because Danny, who was Eve's printer for many years, we just got back in touch with, he printed the whole show. And he created this beautiful print, which in many ways it's wonderful to see, because for a long time we weren't in touch with him and he wasn't printing her work, and the images didn't kind of shine with the same vibrancy. So for me, kind of seeing this show is another wonderful moment, because it's kind of seeing the combination of actually finding Danny, getting back in touch with him, and seeing how Eve's work should be viewed, should be printed. And Anne saw the image, and she said she just became very emotional, kind of standing in front of the print, because it was almost like the lady was staring back at her, and she said she could feel almost like it was Eve staring back at her. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much. And I'd love to invite any questions or comments or yes.
Sorry, it sounded like quite a boring question, but first of all, thank you. That was brilliant and so interesting, inspiring, all those kind of words. Did she have a favourite film that she used to work with?
Did Eve have a favourite film that she worked on?
Yeah, as in not the film, as in the movie, but as in roll of film that you put in the camera.
So, in terms of colour photography, I know that yes. So she worked with Kodachrome. So in terms of black and white,
Yes.
it was
Tri-X.
Yes. Well done. Yeah. I should say Tri-X. Yeah. Because it's interesting. The photograph at the very beginning of me, where she took a photograph of actually this one when I was 16, was actually the beginning of a photo lesson. So she decided she wanted to kind of give me an introduction to photography. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my career. I didn't know I wanted to be a photographer. But she gave me a camera, she gave me some film, and she gave me some photography lessons. And it was Tri-X that she gave me. Yeah.
She worked in the Kodak. She must have worked in that coating plant, I reckon.
Yes. Yeah. But for many years, she started out in black and white, and she started to move into colour when she started working at the Sunday Times magazine, when the whole kind of colour movement started. But she wasn't always happy with the technology of colour. And it's interesting because black and white was always seen as the kind of artistic medium, and up until fairly recently, colour was always seen as kind of holiday stamps. And then when she went to China, I'm pretty sure the whole thing was done with Kodachrome, and she loved the fact that because it came out with a transparency, a positive. So instead of being a negative, she had a slide that she would then load into the slide projector, and when she came back from her trips, she would always show the slides on the wall, and I was lucky enough to actually get to witness her kind of doing a slide presentation. And what she loved was the kind of the glow of the inner glow of the images. And that's when she started working with Danny. She actually met Danny on the set of White Nights, and he was one of the pioneers of Cibachrome. I don't know if any photographers will probably know about Cibachrome, which is a medium that you can't use anymore because it's got damaging effects on the environment, the chemical that they use. But the paper has this kind of iridescence, it had like an inner glow.
Punchy.
Yes, yeah, and it's almost like looking at liquid, it's got a kind of liquid kind of glow to it. And she loved the fact that and she said to Danny, she said, could you make what I'm seeing on the screen, this kind of inner glow that you see on the screen, I'll choose the colour one you can see. Like that. Can you create the inner glow that I see on the screen in the image? And Danny said, okay, well let's work with the Cibachrome. And that's what he did. And what I've been really amazed to see is that when you look at the colour images that he's reproduced, he wanted to get that same kind of glow, that kind of inner glow, but without using the Cibachrome technology. And he's been able to do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Did she print initially? Did she print her own? Did she do her processing and printing her black and white?
She did, yes. When she started out, yeah. So I never saw her in the darkroom. My dad got to kind of be with her in the darkroom, and he described this amazing kind of excitement of those were the days when you get the film and you develop it in the darkroom. And she said, literally, she would never know what was going to come out until she went into the darkroom. And my dad would sit with her in the darkroom and just watch in awe as these beautiful images appeared in the trays. The liquid would materialise these images in front of their eyes. So yeah.
So she had the control. That was the thing, to have the control of the final product.
Well, yes, but then she later realised that printers could do a better job than she could do. And that's when she started working with Danny, and he did the colour work, and then she had another black and white printer. But she loved working with Danny because he would experiment. He would kind of come up with new ways of making her vision manifest on paper. And he would go to her flat with proofs that he'd done, and she would say, okay, that's not quite right. That needs a bit more this kind of colour, a bit more this. And he learnt exactly what she wanted, and he learned about his craft, but also about what she wanted. And then he would kind of come up with a final version. Yeah, that's what I wanted. That's how it should look. But she was very exacting. Yeah, she knew what she wanted. She had an image of what she wanted, and she was very kind of perfectionist in a way. She had a vision of how it should look. Like with the taking the photographs of the birth scene. She had a vision of what she wanted to show. And at one point she talked about she had the heyday of photojournalism, and she described it as she said in those days we were naive enough to think that we could hold a mirror up to the world and perhaps make a difference. And I'd like to think that she did actually have an effect in actually showing things to people that they wouldn't have otherwise got to see. But she was always very modest about it. She would never say like, oh yes, but it was genuine. She worked diligently and she did her part.
Was she very artistic at school and in her really early years? I mean, did she draw and?
That's a good question. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. My dad might.
I just wondered, with her education and early years, 20s and everything, before she got into photography.
I don't think
she
so.
dabbled in other things, or.
I don't think so.
So really, her love of photography came about from the practical process that she was involved in.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's a love of observation more than photography.
Yes, very good point. Yeah, no, because she was curious, and she would, and that's one thing that she taught me about when she gave me some photography lessons. She would say, it's as much about looking and seeing as it is about capturing the images. In order to capture it, you have to be able to see what's going on, understand about the composition, and know what you want to capture. And I think you're right. It was that kind of curiosity of seeing the world around her and wanting to capture and wanting to show to people what she was seeing.
So she, you mentioned that she moved to London in 1960 and had the Sunday job at the Sunday Times. She travelled the world with her. Was she ever tempted to go back to the States and work for one of the publications there?
That's a good question. I think London became her home, England became her adopted home. She may have had offers, but I think she really loved working for the Sunday Times, the freedom that it gave her, because at that time they would send her off around the world and say, right, just go to Russia for 3 months. And, that would never happen now. That's just not possible. And I think that working for the Sunday Times afforded her this ability to explore, and she worked with I think it was Michael Rand, who was the editor of the Sunday Times at that time, and he would let her kind of do whatever she wanted. They would come up with ideas together, and she would say, I want to do this story, and he would go, okay, great, just go off and do it. And he would give her the resources to go off and do it. So I think that was kind of one of the main drives. But I think she also fell in love with England, and she described, she kind of, there's a whole book she did called, in America it was called The Great British, but it was kind of ironic kind of take on it, but in England it was called in Britain. But she kind of like enjoyed kind of poking fun at the British. Like she always found it fascinating when the convention of having these little sandwiches with the crust cut off, the cucumber sandwiches. But she adopted that herself, and when people came around for tea, she would make them these little cucumber sandwiches.
That actually inspired Martin Parr.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, she knew Martin Parr, and I don't know whether he drew influence from that.
Is that a fact actually, that he was quite trying?
I haven't talked to him about that, but I'm sure he was. I mean, I talked to, I had interactions with Steve McCurry, who was, he said he was a big influence of his, and I'm sure Martin Parr was in some way influenced by his work.
So, sorry. I heard she carried 3 cameras with her so she could be reactive in each situation. Did she spend a long time in sort of post-production, or did she was trying to sort of frame up the shot? Do you know that?
When you say post-production?
Well, editing, cropping, all of that, or was she just trying to sort of capture that moment with the lens?
That's a good question. So she didn't do a lot of cropping. There are a few images that she would crop, but mostly she aimed, and it was also part of the Magnum tradition of not cropping, of trying to kind of frame it with the lens. And occasionally it didn't quite work out, and she decided when she printed it she would crop it. But mostly, I tell you something really interesting. So this one in the desert, it's a shame I haven't got the image of it, but I've seen the contact sheet of this. And it's really fascinating because she's trying different things out, and the shot just before this, it's portrait format, and it doesn't work at all. It's an interesting picture, but it doesn't have this kind of panoramic aspect to it. And you look through her contact sheets, and I used to sit with her sometimes, and she would circle them, and obviously the contact sheets have the circles of the one she wanted to print. But on this one, you can see how she kind of came up with that image. It was like all the other ones around it aren't this iconic image, and it's very easy to look at all these pictures and just imagine every single one of these shots is like, oh yeah, got it. I can see that was going to be iconic, But out of a roll of 36 images, maybe 1 or 2 she might use, and that was very common. And it's in the world of digital photography. It's interesting. I wonder how that's going to play out, because these days people take a digital photograph and they delete it if they don't like it. Whereas there was no possibility of deleting anything, and luckily we have. Eve took about 250,000 images in her lifetime, and we're still going through them and looking at ones that haven't been seen and kind of re-editing. And she was even doing that towards the end of her life. She was kind of re-editing and going back and saying, "Oh, I'm going to miss that one," because the editorial process for the magazines. The editors of the magazines wanted a certain image, and she had to kind of play to what they wanted. But when you go back and look at the contact sheets, different images jump out, and you see kind of things that perhaps you've missed previously.
Did she actually edit this selection here, or was that somebody else that curated these images?
So yes, so these were created by a woman called Maya Binkin. She was the creator of this show. But you know, I myself and Danny worked with her. Danny knows her archive very intimately, and we kind of suggested images. But Maya wanted to do something, and she's done an amazing job that really shows the kind of the breadth of her body of work. And it's wonderful because it's really being picked up by the press, because often Eve is when she's in the press, it's like the Marilyn Monroe images, which is wonderful. But I think what's really wonderful is that this show kind of captures the Harlem fashion images. Some of them have never been seen before. You know, a lot of images from the birth story haven't been exhibited before, and it really kind of captures the breadth and the depth of Eve's work. You know, there's a quote that I didn't put in here, which is I think it's Robert Capa, who was one of the founding members of Magnum Photos, and he said Eve's work falls between Marina Dietrich's legs and the bitter lives of migratory potato pickers. And she loved that quote because it really nicely sums up, you know, her work, because there was the celebrity photographs, and then there was the migratory potato pickers, there was the dispossessed peoples. But what's wonderful is that another quote she said, I never saw anybody as ordinary or extraordinary. I just saw them as people in front of my lens. And I think that really kind of comes through in her images. And I think that's the kind of the enduring kind of appeal of a lot of her images, is the humanity that comes through. There's something that we can sense of our shared humanity that people are really drawn to.
It's a very rare thing, and I was listening to a podcast the other day, they were talking about how very difficult it is to remain objective, and I think there's no sense of judgment at all in any of these photographs. As you say, she takes an image with this compassion, humanity. There's no judgment in whatever the subject is, and that's a very difficult thing to
Yes, exactly.
and maintain over decades is phenomenal.
That's right.
Skill.
Yeah, and I think it was something that she was very aware of and that she also cultivated, because she realised that she needed to have, you know, she realised that she couldn't be totally objective because it was her taking the photograph, but she wanted to not impose, she wanted to take away as much imposition as possible. She wanted to show something unfiltered as much as possible. Obviously it's not totally possible, but yeah, she realised that she had to have no judgment. She had to, and that's, I think, where the curiosity came in, and she realised that by being curious and by having a relationship and by kind of trying to get to the essence of the person, that was all part of the process of you know, the compassion is the best antidote for judgment.
Michael, do you know if there's in Eve's archive there's any pictures of Cassius Clay?
No, she never did.
Right, okay. Shame.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. There's some pictures of James Brown downstairs, who was part of the Black is Beautiful movement. But no, she never photographed Cassius Clay.
Do you have a favourite yourself?
Do I have a favourite? Good question. I've got a few favourites. I think that the girl in the bar in Cuba is one of my favourites. This one. It's hard to pick one. Trying to think of that one, and perhaps this one, the horse. I love the horse. I mean, this doesn't quite come out on the screen, but if you look at Danny's print downstairs, he actually renders it even more beautifully in the print than on the screen. But
It's got a magical quality, isn't it?
Exactly, there's kind of dreamlike quality to it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael.
Thank
That
you
was
very
really fantastic. A real treat. So,
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you.